stuff. Okay, so Peter Thompson, he's 50 years as a coach is meaningless if you've been doing the same thing each year. But British-born Peter Thompson has been coaching athletes and coaching coaches since 1968, making practice and learning innovative, interesting, amusing, and involving. This co-founder in 1982 of USATF Coach Education, former director of IAAF Global Coaches Education, is the innovator of the new interval training, and most recently, biokinetics and the fourth energy system. He concentrates on developing athlete and coach competence. His post-collegiate athletes have set 6 world records. So Peter, welcome. Thank you for attending today. The show is yours.
Jimson, thank you very much for that introduction. And it just reminds me of how long I have been coaching. So like a lot of you guys out there too, you've been coaching a while. So
okay.
We're seeing the presentation with the slides on the left. So
yeah, I see your whole desktop actually, which is fine because the minute you hit,
there you go.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay, all set.
Good. So as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about a reevaluation of the concept of the stretch shortening cycle, because the stretch shortening cycle is something we're all familiar with, and we can kind of come back and discuss our possibly different understandings at the moment. But I wanted to talk about this morning the MTAU, what it is and how it does what it does. And there's an evolution. I went back with my work to 1938. So 1938 was A.V. Hill, Archibald Vernon Hill, who actually got a lot of recognition prior to this. He had an amazing career. Now, you're all familiar with A.V. Hill, right? So A.V. Hill was the guy who looked basically into all the energetics of muscle action. And he first proposed the muscle tendon unit. He's the first person to really identify the muscle tendon unit. And he did this in 38, and he looked at it in terms of being a 3-component model. And you'll see the muscle sheath was just an undifferentiated muscle sheath, it was called. There were muscle fibers, which are the contractile component, the CC, and there's a tendon, which is the series elastic component, and then muscle sheath with a parallel elastic component. So those of you who've done basic physics know that various units, various items can be connected either in parallel or in series. And so he proposed that the muscle tendon unit comprised these 3 components. And really at that time, he was looking at energy created by heat, and he examined the heat production in muscles. And he did amazing work based on the equipment he had. He had an amazing quality to see inside human beings and to kind of unravel how they were actually kind of operating. So that was the very early work then of Hill, and he had this 3-component model. And he also, in 1922, prior to this, when he defined isometrics, and he said when a muscle creates force but doesn't change length, it creates more force, most force. So that was something he proposed then. So what happened? What changed? So what changed was only in recent years, in the last probably decade, or more importantly in the last 5 years, there's been an amazing radiation of equipment whereby we can now examine the tissues inside the body in vivo, in the living human organism. I mean, go back to Hill. Hill did a lot of his work on frog legs and frog muscles. Now we're able to do a lot more work looking at what's happening inside the human body in vivo. And obviously, previously everything in terms of tissues was done in vitro, and in vitro was with cadavers, and cadavers, as we probably well appreciate, don't have much of an elastic response. So there was a lot of stresses and strains in the body which we knew were being kind of produced from the external results, but we couldn't see what tissues were involved and which tissues were doing what. So this research looks at ultrasonography, 3D ultrasound, elastography, and magnetic resonance. And all of those techniques allow us to see what stresses and strains are produced in the living organism. So it has changed the way we think about things dramatically. And we find that there are structures doing things which we didn't appreciate before. And we find there are structures who we thought were doing things and not actually doing what we thought they were doing. So it has kind of forced a reevaluation. And I think that this is something which is going to continue in the next, well, into the future. But for right now, it's a very exciting opportunity. So we see that this, in the living organism, that there is something in terms of tissues that's contributing which we weren't aware of, and that is the aponeurosis. So the aponeurosis is one of the connective tissues, but it's something which was not clearly appreciated what it was doing. How many of you are familiar with the term aponeurosis? Richie is, Nico is. So aponeurosis, and Jimson is, yep. And aponeurosis is a sheet-like structure. So it's related to a tendon in terms of its ability to be very, very elastic, but it's different from a tendon. And the classic example, if you want to know what an aponeurosis is, the plantar fascia is in fact a plantar aponeurosis. And so these aponeuroses have the ability to store and return elastic energy, much in the same way as the tendon does, but with important differences. So that gave us the appreciation that it's probably not the muscle tendon unit that we should be talking about, but we should be talking about the muscle tendon aponeurosis unit. So here we've got an example in the running action. And in the running action, the aponeuroses is connected in parallel, the tendon is connected in series, and the muscle fibers are the contractile element. And so if you look at that, I created that diagram in 2016 and just modifying what Hill had done, and also adding the fact that the aponeurosis works in parallel to the tendon. So that's where I was in my kind of thinking there once I'd started reading about the aponeurosis, is that we've got these parallel elastic elements, and we've got these series elastic elements, and we've got the contractile element. But one of the things we found is that in the running action, the contractile element actually is not functioning the way we thought it was. And we'll come back to that later. But basically, I want you to keep that in mind, is that running provided us a vision of how the muscle might now be acting given the elastic properties of both the tendons and the aponeuroses working together. So to put that diagram, so that diagram is kind of horizontal, which, let's put it in terms of the calf, the lower leg. And if we look at that, we can see that the aponeuroses, the calf muscles, the tendon, and the plantar fascia, that this is how the diagram looked. And this is where I had the diagram in 2017. And I was presenting this, and you probably have done this yourselves. When you're presenting material, you suddenly kind of get an aha moment. And I looked at it and I thought, it's wrong. it's wrong. The diagram needs to be changed, because in fact, this is what we're seeing is the plantar aponeurosis is in series to the tendon, and there is an aponeurosis around the Achilles tendon, there's an aponeurosis around the muscle. So we've got the aponeurosis can be both the aponeurosis can both be a parallel elastic element and also a series elastic element. So the aponeurosis have this ability to provide additional elastic energy return. One of the important things that we learned about the aponeurosis is that whereas tendons are uniaxial, which means they can only store and return energy in terms of its longitudinal length, the aponeurosis are multiaxial. And so this allows the aponeurosis to provide a lot of energy return in situations where the tendon is not so well adapted. It also includes things like if we take a muscle being isovolumetric, if a muscle is the same volume all the time, but changes shape, then when a muscle goes through a concentric contraction and it becomes shorter and fatter, it's the aponeurosis which helps to accommodate that fattening through its multiaxial response. And conversely, when the muscle eccentrically contracts and lengthens, the aponeurosis has the ability through its multiaxial to take into account both the width changes of the muscle as well as the length changes. So the tendon is only responsible for reacting in the uniaxial way, but the aponeurosis has this powerful contribution multi-axially.
Peter, on the flip side to that, if the aponeurosis works multi-axially, and then you actually have stress from an inflammatory response on the aponeurosis, let's say opposite to series, but more in parallel, then that becomes the rate determining step as to how movement will happen. You know, so the question then becomes, when we look at the aponeurosis, and basically it's collagen based and it's fibrous based. The thing is, when you're looking at issues like, for instance, compartment syndrome, which has to do with the fact that the fascia has does not allow any elasticity, so therefore the muscle doesn't have any breathing room. I mean, the question then I have is that the tendon itself then is the one that will be taking more of the stress, will it not?
The tendon always will take more of the stretch, definitely.
Okay.
And what the aponeurosis do, I believe, is provide additional energy return.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
In different ways, and if you're doing, say, for example, torsional movements, I think once we're doing, say, when you're looking at the throwing events, in the throwing events, I think the aponeurosis have a very different role to play there. I think that they have a role in the oblique kinetic chains. So what we're talking about is the kinetic chains and understanding this idea of the muscle tendon aponeurosis unit being a clearly defined elastic component working together and in synergy. So when we talk about any stretch shortening, if we're talking about stretch shortening, then it involves both the tendon and, to a lesser extent, the aponeurosis. So the aponeurosis is probably never going to be the major contributor, but it's going to be a subsidiary and a previously unrecognized
I see.
contributor.
Because I know for a fact that if the fascial tissue is inflamed, it actually loses its elasticity by about 20%.
Right.
Which then means you're loading the tendon a lot more in order to do the same amount of movement.
Yep. yeah. So there are consequences, and yeah, that's another area, but we may touch back on that later.
Okay, sorry for interrupting, but it was
No,
just, I
no,
just
appreciate you.
clarified.
No, no, it's a great interruption. Well, it wasn't an interruption; it was a great intervention, and adds to the conversation. So,
Okay.
as I said, in running, what we know now is that in the model of running, the contractile element is you rather than the muscle being actively involved in running, you want the muscle to be in isometric mode essentially, so that the elastic tissues are able to optimize their return and both in time and in power. So we saw that in 22, Hill noted about the isometric fixed length force production, but then Fenn in 23, the Fenn effect. So when a muscle is in isometric mode, it uses less metabolic energy. And so we're now talking about in running, if the contractile element in running is not so active, then this is going to be a metabolic energy sparing contribution. And so what that means is that you'll run with less bioenergetic, less metabolic cost for a certain speed, or the value added part of that is for the same metabolic cost, you can run at a faster speed. So it's a performance enhancing kinetic, and that's where biokinetics came in, is the kinetic return within the body.
So you're basically saying in a nutshell is that the muscle can function isometrically, but the storage of energy and the elastic recoil is actually functioning through the aponeurosis and the tendon.
Correct. In running.
Gotcha.
So,
okay, interesting. Thank
yeah.
you.
So if we move on here, so we tip it the right way up, and we look at, I'm just wondering, can you guys see the bar, the share screen bar? Jimson, do you see this bar? You don't.
No, I don't. No.
It's just something I see. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was concerned about it getting in the way on the slides and moving it around, but if you can't see it, then I don't need to do that. So
we can see everything well.
Excellent. So this is I updated the diagram based on my kind of aha moment when I was presenting and thinking, okay, you may have thought yourself that you've done it in 2017, but in 2020, I refined it and produced this diagram, which shows the muscle fibers, shows the tendon, shows the aponeuroses around the muscle, the aponeuroses with the plantar fascia, and the aponeuroses around the tendon. So that kind of puts the complex together in a functional way, as you would see it in the living athlete.
Peter, another thing that you can add to this diagram, which is very, very important, is that the aponeurosis is not localized. It's actually one big systemic organ, which then you could add to this is the environmental influence, which is very important as to how the whole fascial system responds to the stress, not only through running, but in processing the environment through the running.
Well, yeah, this is very, very much the case. And I think that you talk there about the fascial system, and my reading finds the fascial system only being clearly identified and defined by two separate organizations last year. Previously, the fascial system was not identified as such. Now, you can correct me on that. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, so as coaches, we've got to be aware that we've got, the skeletal system, the nervous system, and all these things that we had previously as kind of junked under connective tissue. Connective tissue comes now the fascial system, and the fascial system has got various components to it. But the one which I feel that we're most interested in right now as coaches are the aponeuroses. And the aponeuroses run right through the kinetic chain, and,
Right.
and work with the muscles and the other connective tissues to provide elastic energy return.
Correct. Okay.
So this is just a comparison of tendons and aponeuroses to kind of help people get an idea of it. They're both tough and resilient, and tendons primarily connect muscles to bones. Aponeuroses are tough and resilient, may involve muscles or connects bone to bone. Tendons and aponeuroses, basically similar sort of materials, but tendons a rope-like structure where aponeuroses tend to be a flat structure like a sheet. Tendons and aponeuroses both capable of resisting considerable strain and have elastic properties that may return, amplify, or attenuate forces. So they're both similar in that. Tendons only act as series elastic element, and aponeuroses act as both parallel elastic elements and as series elastic elements. And this advantage with the aponeuroses of being multi-axial, having the ability to return elastic energy relating to strain in a multi-axial manner. And so I think that again clearly separates it from tendons. But tendons are still our strongest and our most powerful source of returning elastic energy. But the aponeuroses have an important role to play, depending, the research has only just started in this, but one of the studies I read said that they felt that the aponeuroses contributed 10 to 15% of the energy return while running. And so the tendon giving 85 to 90%, and the aponeuroses contributing 10 to 15%. So if that's the case, that would be a significant contribution. So here's the old concept of the stretch-shortening cycle, a three-phase eccentric movement of the muscles, amortization, and then a concentric contraction of the muscle. So it's using the contractile elements of the muscles eccentrically and concentrically. And we always had discussions about amortization. Is amortization a process or a point? In terms of strict English, amortization is a point. So if you've got a loan and you amortize it, it's the moment you change it from what it is into something else. And so in the English language, to amortize something is a point. But as coaches, we've generally used amortization to be a process and having a time frame to it. But that's the old model. So preload, control, explode. Just explains the eccentric loading phase, the amortization phase, which can be of various lengths, and then the explode, the returning force. And how was it explained? Why was that important? Does that movement actually occur in track and field athletics that much? Does that counter movement occur that much? Well, let's look here at now three fundamental sport movements. So Roberts and Azizi created this diagram in 2011. And it really had resonance with me because it talked about the difference of the center of path of the center of mass in different activities. So there you'll see in A, it's talking about energy conservation. And this is the early diagram that I saw. And what I liked was it was looking at the path of the center of mass, and it was identifying what structures were active and when. So it said that if you are working with energy conservation, when you're moving along, your muscle is inactive. It's in isometric, but it's not inactive, it's in isometric mode, but the elastic is taken with the tendon. And so you've got to remember that these guys are operating on a muscle tendon unit. They're not working on a muscle tendon aponeurosis unit. They're just working on an MTU. And then when you look at the power amplification, this could be starting out of the starting blocks, for example, where there is a raising of the center of mass. The muscle acts first, and that stores energy, elastic energy in the tendon, which then comes back quicker than the force was put into it. And so that amplifies the power. And we see that in track and field a lot. And then power attenuation. Here you'll see the center of mass lowering. And in this case, when the center of mass is lowering, when you have ground contact, the muscle is inactive initially, and the tendon absorbs the landing force, and then the tendon lets that force go back into the eccentric contraction, or if you like, the eccentric contraction takes that force out of the tendon by working eccentrically. So that is what Roberts and Azizi put forward in 2011. And it looked at things being three fundamental movements. And I thought about track and field athletics, and I felt that that kind of was a useful way to look at things, and perhaps more useful than the stretch-shortening cycle. So let's move along with this and see where it takes us. So in our human movement, we're usually concerned with one of these three movements. We're working with keeping the center of mass on a low amplitude, like running, and that can be whether it's running middle, long distance, or maximal sprinting. If you're maximal sprinting, then you're trying to keep the center of mass on a low amplitude, and you've got a horizontal pathway to an overall horizontal pathway to the center of mass. If you're dealing with power, you're raising and powerfully accelerating the center of mass. And if you're absorbing, imagine if you're coming in for a long jump, then you're controlling the center of mass in a controlled manner. So those are the energy flows. And if you see, they're different in each of those three situations. So I took this diagram, and this was the diagram that was in the Roberts and Azizi work. And I thought about in the context of the muscle tendon aponeurosis unit, and also in the context of the kinetic chain. And so I created this diagram where we're looking at the energy flow now involving the tendon and aponeurosis or aponeuroses, and the kinetic chain emphasis. So in running, hopping, bounding, walking, the kinetic chain emphasis is probably control of stiffness. For jumping, accelerating, incline running, for power amplification, the kinetic chain emphasis is probably control of extension. For power attenuation, for energy absorption, like decline running or deceleration or landing, when you're in one of those modes, then we're controlling stiffness and flexion. So that's where I put the kinetic chain emphasis. Yes, please.
Can I say something to the rest of the group?
Yes, please.
Guys, this is why you don't do static stretching before an activity, and why it should be taken out of as a form of flexible training, because exactly what happens here is you lose that energy transference, which is very, very important to keep. So that's why we move towards dynamic flexibility as the means of being the way of helping the system have increases in range of motion from a functional point of view. This
Lovely, thanks very much. No, thank you. Thank you. So if we look at these individually, as I say, this is covering the first part of what I want to talk about. This is just looking again at situation A. This is a situation where you're running, and the mechanical energy is conserved when the elastic structures store and recover cyclical changes in the mechanical energy of the body or an appendage. And so it's temporarily stored in the tendons and the aponeuroses and then returned to the body. So this is where you would say in running or hopping and bounding and walking, then at foot contact, you would want the muscle, and again, it's not cognitive, this is just what the muscle does. The muscle would naturally be in an isometric situation, and it's the tendon and aponeurosis which take up the elastic energy and then return it. And so this has the ability to be the fourth energy system in biokinetics. In biokinetics is all about the storage of elastic energy in the body's tissues and then the return of it. And so we now need to think of the three metabolic energy systems, and then there's the fourth energy system, which is the biokinetic energy system. So here we're talking about control of stiffness. So what do I mean by stiffness? Well, what is stiffness? So stiffness, would anybody like to throw out a definition?
I can try, because I talked with Wolfgang Ritzdorf about this like 15 years ago or so, and it was an interesting concept that sort of explained what I already knew was happening, but it's basically it's the ability to resist. Well, actually, let me say this first. Amortization in a mortgage does have a time component because you got the amortization tables after that. And that reminded me, because here it's the ability to resist too much amortization and allow the body to be in position for proper extension and condition. So in the eccentric and MTAU process is loading up energy, resisting too much amortization in terms of dropping hips too low, so it's not ideal to come out of it, and then returning the energy with the extension. I know that was messy, but that's the best I can do.
No, it's a good view of it. And I think the thing is, I would take away the phrase resisting. I would take away that phrase, because stiffness is all about the ability. So if we take the kinetic chain, and if we imagine the kinetic chain from the top of the head to your feet, and if you're too stiff, and I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see this, there's a spring here, and this spring is a very stiff spring, and so I can't compress it, and so it can't store much energy because it's so stiff. If, on the other hand, here's another spring, and this spring is very, very soft. And so here, it's very easy to compress the spring, but it doesn't return much energy, because when it's compressed, it is unable, it doesn't have the correct stiffness to return the energy it's stored. And so if I've got this spring, this can optimally store and return the optimal amount of energy. And so if we think about the kinetic chain, again, I use the analogy of running. If you're running across a car park by the seashore and you're running across the cement, then your kinetic chain will have a certain stiffness. And in running, we're talking about the stiffness usually from the pelvis on down. So there's differential stiffness in the body. So when we're running, the upper body is going to be more stiff than the lower kinetic chain, because the lower kinetic chain is the one which is going to store and return energy. So that's the stiffness, it's the compressibility of that element which is important. So if we're running across a car park by the seashore, and we're running across, we're using a certain stiffness. If now adjacent to the car park is straight onto the sand of the beach, soft sand, if we were to run easily off the car park onto that sand, our stiffness would change to accommodate that softer surface, and our lower kinetic chain would become stiffer to accommodate that less compliant surface. So what happens if you sprint off that car park onto the sand is that you may well stumble and fall because your stiffness does not have time to adapt. And so we now know, A, that stiffness is changeable within the body, within the kinetic change. chain, and we know that stiffness takes time to change. So knowing those two things, why would we not then, as coaches, create situations where each and every athlete can develop the skill of having accessibility to the most adaptable stiffness possible?
So that way you would bring in more isometric work. Because
Yes, that would be a consequence, but you wouldn't do that cognitively. That would be a subconscious result, because your body is solving the problem is I'm running onto this soft sand and my body is going to respond to that. If I go too fast initially, it's not going to be able to respond. But if I progressively over months and months go faster. So it's about changing the compliance of what is under your foot. That is what changes. Stiffness will change to accommodate that. So it's talking about wearing shoes with different thicknesses and different geometers, different elasticity in the midsole. So wearing shoes of different midsole capabilities, running on different surfaces. So running on everything from concrete, really non-compliant, onto soft sand, which is hyper-compliant. Running up and downhill changes stiffness. Generally, when we run uphill, we get a little stiffer. When we run downhill, we get a little less stiff. When we go faster, we get stiffer. So we've got all of these things which as coaches we do, but now we also understand that they have the ability to help the athlete develop an adaptable stiffness, because stiffness is an adaptable biomechanical quality. And I think it is, it's an unconscious skill. So for example, with a high school team that I know locally, they have a 1,000-meter warm-up circuit that I help them create, which has both cement, track, artificial grass, natural grass, which has been overwatered and quite soggy sometimes, and gravel paths. And so they do this 1,000-meter loop as part of their warm-up. And I believe this helps to prime the stiffness, just as when you're doing some of your acceleration runs that you do in your warm-up, primes the biokinetics, it primes the stiffness, because optimal stiffness will give the optimal biokinetic energy return. So the more you can control stiffness, the better you will get this biokinetic energy return from the athlete.
Alan's got a question for you.
Even you're saying running downhill, at what gradient would you run downhill up to before it becomes too much of a braking force and a balance issue?
Well, again, that's like so different for each athlete, Alan, because just like running across the car park onto the sand, some athletes will naturally be able to do that much faster straight away. And it's the same with the slopes you run on. So you vary the slopes. It's not always the same slope. So it's variety, and more variety. The more variety you have of speed, of slope, of what's under your foot, either in the shoe or on the surface you're running on, the more you have of that, the more you develop the ability for the athlete to have adaptable, optimal stiffness. And that is partly injury proofing the athlete, because they're going to be, if you're too stiff, if the spring is too stiff, then you're transferring the stresses to the hard tissue, to the bone. So you're going to be more likely suffering bone stress fractures. If you're too soft, then the soft tissues have to work harder to control the lack of integrity in the kinetic chain. And so you're more likely to soft tissue injuries if your stiffness is too soft tissue. If your stiffness is too hard, then hard tissue, stress fractures, so on.
Peter, could I mention a kind of simplified form of this that I think I spoke about to you the other day? The Altus people, when they had a program for the NFL prospects with part of their combined training, they very simply, every couple of steps on the track, put out something like a yoga mat,
Right.
something that was just that much softer. And these were big guys just getting ready to do their 40-yard dash time. But that was a very simple way of being able to do it.
Yep.
At the track, I thought.
Other thing that
No,
we
definitely,
also have-
Malcolm. It's 100%. It's a good example, and it shows that they've been thinking about this idea that there is the potential for the athlete to accommodate to something different under their foot.
Peter, one question that I have is, that's fine and dandy if we have people below 30 years of age, but as you well know from your from the research that I've done and stuff like this, that the older you get, you start losing that stiffness regardless at the myotendon junction. How would you actually deal with trying to maintain or help create that stiffness for veteran athletes? Because by nature of age themselves, they lose that elasticity.
Yep.
And that stiffness.
I'll park that one, if I may, for the moment, because it's a really good topic, but we'll come back to that if we can later. And that's something which I'm very, very aware of. And yeah, one of the things you're trying to do with masters athletes is get them to, many times they've been socialized out of natural movement. And so you've got to kind of reintroduce playful, thoughtless movement into their program. But
also their consciousness. The one thing, sorry, Richie, I'm monopolizing, but the one thing that I actually have to throw out there as a group is the idea when we were younger to jump like 2 or 3 feet, we never thought about it. But as we get older, then we're sort of trying to calculate, can I take this jump? Can I not take this jump? Which actually then becomes a proprioceptive response as to how you're going to take that veteran athlete and be able to get them to get past that, that consciousness of allowing them to be able to do these movements as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's come back on that because it's a really good topic. Yeah. Richie?
I just had a quick question. It's not as easily used to transition smoothly in one's motion, but would not changing shoes and even barefoot serve some of the same purpose? Doing that, mixing that in with wearing shoes, training shoes, spikes, barefoot. Obviously, you don't want to go barefoot from grass to turf to gravel, maybe grass to turf, but in terms of what you're talking about, is that not a similar way of doing that?
Yeah, I mean, there are many ways you can kind of to do it. For the athletes I work with, they warm up in usually Hoka shoes, which have got a 34 millimeter drop, and so not 34 millimeter drop, 34 millimeter heel stack, and about a 4 millimeter drop. Then for their priming the biokinetics, they would go into their spikes, and they do a little bit of work in their spikes. And then they probably do the session in their racing flats. And then they would go back into their warm-up shoes to cool down. And I won't touch on it now, other than I'll come back to it later, but I will say that I do not have the athletes I work with wear carbon-plated shoes in practice. And I'll come back to that later, but that's just an aside to come back on. So let's progress with the ABC situation. We looked at A, which is the running situation, or hopping and bounding and walking, where the center of mass is essentially moving in a horizontal plane. And then we've got, this just says what we talked about earlier, which is that the old view of the stretch-shortening cycle is probably not applicable in running, since for running economy, the muscle is vitally important as a stabilizer and a resistance, but it's the elastic properties of the tendon and the aponeurosis which returns the energy and amplifies the energy. So here's we talk about power amplification, and this could be, let's say, out of the starting blocks. It could be a takeoff for a long jump. It could be a takeoff for a high jump. It could be a takeoff for a pole vault, Richie. Could be a takeoff for a triple jump. So in this situation, in the starting blocks, you're stationary. And so to put the tendon on stretch, the muscle contracts concentrically. and that puts elastic energy into the tendon, and the tendon is able to return that faster than the muscle put it in, and so there's a power amplification. And in all times, we want to be, in terms of the lower kinetic chain, we want to be controlling the extension of the kinetic chain. So things like jumping, acceleration, incline running would involve this, where we're raising the center of mass. And the incline running would be probably a very low grade on that. It's not a steep hill. So if we're thinking about the incline, it's not hill running. It's a slight incline that you're running up. So if we look at the final one, the power attenuation or the energy absorption, sorry, go back, rushing you to that point. This is where you're either decline running, decelerating, and landing. And deceleration, I mean, you all as coaches coach your athletes to decelerate, I hope, as much as you teach them to accelerate. Because in acceleration, you never want to compromise the power production. You always want to be maximizing your power output in acceleration. But in deceleration, that can be done as slowly as possible. And the energy absorption, we see here that every time the foot contacts the ground, the initial strain is taken in the tendon, because that can react quickly. And then the muscle reacts following that eccentrically to release the tension on the muscle. So there's this energy flow through the muscle tendon aponeurosis unit, and remembering that the plantar fascia is part of all of this. So yeah, that's why I wanted to come to a pause for reflection. So I've been presenting to you for a while. And I think it's a good opportunity to take some more generalized questions, if I may.
Again, sorry to half repeat the same question here, Peter, but in downhill running, how much would you allow a heel strike, especially as you're saying, if you're in the big Hoka shoes, you're running on a real cushion and you won't feel it as much, but it's poor sprinting mechanics. So how much of a heel strike would you allow on a downhill run?
Well, I think that's a question which answers itself really, Alan, that I don't allow anything from my athletes. I try to create an environment in which their natural movement is able to express itself. And then I look and see if there's potential problems, if there's something causing something that, for example, with runners, the most common thing is contacting the ground too far in front of the center of mass. So if you're running downhill, that's a tendency. So the emphasis is always on relaxation and frequency. And I don't coach any athlete to put any part of their foot specifically on the ground at any part of the gait cycle. I let that be a natural thing, because at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily matter whether you contact heel first, midfoot, or forefoot, that once the foot is under the, and this is in middle and long distance running, once the foot is under the center of mass, your whole foot is on the ground. And so essentially from center mid support, when your foot is under the center of mass, to take off, to toe off, the action is similar, essentially the same. And so I don't believe there's a right or wrong way to contact the ground, and so I would never coach that. And I don't know if that answers your question, Alan.
Yeah. Just one comment for sprints, hurdles, jumps. It does become more important because you contact heel first, you spend too much time on the ground, you toe first, you're probably reaching, things like that. But I, years ago, after saying, lift the knee, lift the hip up, finally I was like, flex your hip, fire your hip straight down, your foot goes right on the ground the way it should, right underneath you, just like you said. Because we have a lot of young people who reach, or they pull their heels up, or they, well, if you focus on the hips, that helps get rid of that.
Yeah, I think it's a question of, I think you're quite right there, Richie, and it's a question of whether you're sprinting maximally or running middle or long distance. You want to be running in the box, that you essentially want to have a symmetry between front side and back side distances, and certainly not, no matter how you contact the ground. And as you say, if you contact heel first when you're sprinting maximally, chances are you're going to be reaching forward and introducing lots and lots of braking forces. So it's a question then of doing the technique drills to get more of a frequency oriented natural way of running.
Peter, I was interested in your comments on the sort of the sprint start position and the contribution of the sort of the stiffness, etc. How much do you think the sort of aponeurosis, etc., need to be, in the sprint start, it's very static. Do they still work, in that sort of situation, do you think? Or do you have to actually, stretch them to get the rebound out of them?
It's a really good question, Mick. And I think the thing is, kind of observably, the athlete should be stationary in the blocks. But we know mentally, a lot of us coach the athletes to rise into the set position and then to think about possibly lowering the center of mass, not physically lowering it, but loading the lower kinetic chain. And I think it's possible to load and to activate. We have no research which proves this that I'm aware of, but it may come eventually. But I think what we're doing is that by loading the lower kinetic chain, we're actually preparing the tendons and aponeuroses to contribute optimally. All of the tissues are where they should be. They're activated. So in the set position, ideally the whole system should be ready to go rather than thinking about being ready to go.
Yeah, I guess it's a question of whether you emphasize, being in a sort of stressed position in that set where everything is, as you say, is tensed, ready to go, or whether you go for a more relaxed position where you can get a sort of reflex action using the sort of stiffness qualities when the gun goes.
I think how you coach it can be many different ways. But I think the result you want is for the athlete not to be tense, because any tension is going to inhibit movement afterwards. Having said that, the activity is going to be when you initially start moving, it's probably going to be the muscle making an initial movement, but which muscle making the initial movement? You can analyze the contribution of either leg. So I think that's a rabbit hole which I don't think the research has gone down yet to give us the stresses and strains data that we might need as coaches to make an opinion on that.
Cool.
Peter, can we come back to the question Nikos posed a little while ago about masters athletes? And
yes, certainly. I mean, just briefly, because I masters athletes is really important, and mostly if a masters athlete comes to you and they've lost their elastic abilities, then it's going to be a long time to recover them. But you're more likely, I believe, to recover elastic abilities than you are in old age to recover lost contractile abilities, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because I'm one that still tries to do things like that.
Right. So I think, if you slowly introduce the right, so for you, a box, kind of a foot high, and just doing a 2-footed jump up onto the box. So it's the upward jumps. Again, we'll come on to talk about plyometrics later, because that's obviously follows on from deciding where the center of mass is going. And whether we need to reconsider what plyometrics we're doing with which athletes and why we're doing them. So
I
think
do a lot of that myself.
yeah, it is recoverable,
Yeah.
Peter. And if you know the difficulty comes with a master athlete who's perhaps been inactive for a period of time.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, and injury can always do that. So you have to, and as we both know, you know, it's much slower coming back from either a rest or an injury as a mastered athlete than it is as a younger athlete. But with proper progression, improvement, you know, you can regain some of those abilities. You probably will never regain, well, yeah, you will never regain the full abilities, but if you do the right loadings, then it's possible. I mean, I've done this with the master athletes I've worked with. I've seen them improve dramatically, and just doing with middle long distance athletes, all of my middle long distance athletes, regardless of age, do flying 30s.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that flying 30s are a great way of developing stiffness.
Yeah. Personally, I've come back from 2 left patellar tendon ruptures.
Yeah.
First one 2008, the last one 2017. So, and I'm still going.
So that would indicate that you perhaps have got a little, you know, kind of your kinetic chain was not stiff enough.
Yeah, in 2008, certainly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was trying to find a video of it, and I didn't find a great one. But when I think it was Mick asking about, or whoever's asking about, you know, stationary in the box. But you can see with high-speed video that's close up, you know, as soon as the athlete starts trying to extend hips, you know, the heel goes back, the calf shortens. You know, you're seeing, and actually, Peter, I'd never, you know, until you explained that this morning, you not only see the shortening, but you see the widening of the calf, the whole, you know, MPAU there. So, but you've got the same things happening in the blocks, but it's like you say, you're relaxed. But once you start applying force, you've got the resistance to the blocks, so everything starts happening. It starts adapting, and
so I'll continue then, if it's okay with you guys.
Yeah, sure.
Yep. So
hey, Peter,
yes.
just went. I'm in about 10 minutes. I'm going to have to ditch out, but I'll make Jimson the host so I can go on. But just so you know why I go away, I've got a class.
So yeah, you guys tell me. I mean, it's. I was planning on this being a max of like 90 minutes. Is that comfortable with you, or would you like it less than that, or?
I'm okay. 20 more minutes.
I'm okay.
Anybody
Fine.
else?
I'm okay with that.
Okay. Yeah. Let's end in 20 minutes.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So let me just quickly go on with this. This just recaps what we were looking at. The 3 movements, the fundamental movements now, which I believe are fundamental movements. So that the standard movement here, I don't think occurs many times in track and field athletics. But then let's look and say, okay, if it's stretch shortening cycle did happen, there's a 3-phase concept. But then if we're doing counter movements, then what's happening in a counter movement? So we might be able to look at the counter movement in terms of this now, that when you go down in a counter movement, your eccentric contraction, first of all, the movement is with the tendon and aponeurosis, then there's an eccentric contraction. And then following that, there is a concentric contraction, and that's how the two, so if we go back to that diagram, it's always been, to me, in the wrong order. It should have been A, C, B, right? Because it took me a while to put C and B together. I mean, it should be obvious, but it took me a while to kind of see that. And that's where I produced this combined diagram, which shows what's happening in a counter movement. So in a plyometric type of movement, that is what's happening. But probably now we need to look at our plyometrics in terms of what's happening with the center of mass. So let's just. So this would be a movement which could produce, this is what we were talking about there, Peter, in terms of jumping up onto a box. This would be the power amplification part of the movement, right? Assuming that this athlete is starting from a static position and is not going down to load and then coming up. If they're starting from that position and just jumping up, then that would be the power amplification mode, jumping upwards. If we think about plyometrics, what's wrong with this diagram?
Well, for me, it's tucking his feet up. I'd want to see him springing vertically over the
He's trying to lift his feet to get over the hurdle.
Yeah, he's not actually getting the height of the hurdle. He's just lifting his feet.
Any safety issues?
Well, apart from catching the hurdle and.
Yeah, he's going the wrong way over the hurdle. I mean, that is just a coaching no-no. You know, why? This is the trouble with YouTube. Not YouTube, but YouTube and the internet, is they put images out there and there's no filtering, and so you get an image like this. I mean, it should be like that.
Yeah.
Right. Going over the correct way. So forget about the actual activity, just the safety aspects. We'd hope that it would show the correct way to use the equipment. But yeah, this is just a simple two-footed repeat jump over a hurdle. So that probably would be a fairly low amplitude for the center of mass. And it would be an activity which would be advantageous for those athletes who are raising or lowering the center of mass. But it may not necessarily be such a good exercise for a runner, whether it's for the maximal velocity phase of sprinting or for a middle or long distance runner. It may not be so relevant. But then in track and field, we do a lot of exercises which may be not as close to what we want, but we do it to condition the nervous system, we do it to condition the tissues, we do it to condition. So it's that concept we have of the action itself, and then first derivative drills, second derivative drills, and third derivative drills. So as we kind of move away with the derivation, we're moving further away from the activity we're talking about. So whilst this may not be the movement of the center of mass specifically for a runner, it may be useful in other aspects, and particularly with a young athlete, because a young athlete's not going to be necessarily a runner. They're going to be an athlete and should be doing all events, and therefore should be experiencing ways in which to activate the center of mass in all the three ways we've looked at in the three fundamental movements. So for young athletes in particular, we need to be working with that multi-event approach. We need to be working with a multi-fundamental movement approach. Once you've got somebody who's a mature senior athlete and they're, say, an 800, 1500 meter runner, then we're probably going to cut down on the third and fourth derivative exercises and spend more time on the derivative exercises closest to the activity and the actual activity itself. So for a senior runner, if it's a runner we're looking at, what might we do to make this more relevant for a runner? Well, we might lower the hurdle and increase the spacing a bit. And so we've got more of a horizontal path to the center of mass, and that may be more relevant to an athlete who's a senior athlete who's specialized in running, middle and long distance, for example. If somebody's a high jumper, then we may make the hurdles even higher. So again, you know, kind of we've got the ability within our equipment to think about how we do plyometrics related to the event that we're going to do. So for a high jumper, probably heightening the hurdles. For a long jumper, would we want to do that? Probably not. Because it's not how high you can raise the center of mass, but it's a combination, isn't it? It's height and out there. So it may be something like this athlete is doing. But it does encourage us to kind of rethink. And if we go back to Verkhoshansky's system of plyometric training, that was a very integrated system, but that was looking at plyometrics in the concept of the standard stretch-shortening cycle. And so it was like plyometrics for everybody. And the progression was this progression, regardless of what event or events you might be doing afterwards. So I think the plyometrics we've got to look at very, very closely. And think about things like depth jumps and drop jumps. Depth jumps and drop jumps are both very useful. Do you guys use either or both of those?
Yeah,
I do.
both. Yeah.
Peter,
Yeah, I do.
use both?
Yes.
Both.
Yep. And Malcolm, what's your experience?
Got a little problem with unmuting. Sorry, Peter. I'm in a house where solar panels are being put in on the roof, so it's a little noisy. But I put in the text that I've tended to go away from just jumping up onto a box. I'm much more about the depth and the drop jumping now, just from the point of view of the reactive time off of the ground.
Right. And understanding now that's a lot more to do with how the elastic tissues are working. Yeah. So yes, I mean, Jay Deshary is a really good researcher and also practical physical therapist. He was in charge of the Virginia clinic, laboratory for biomechanics, and he's moved to Bend, Oregon, and he's written a couple of books which are really good. One's Anatomy for Runners, and the other one is Running Rewired, which, if you haven't seen that, Running Rewired by Jay Deshary is a really excellent read. And the exercises in there, he does a lot of, for runners, Malcolm, jumping up onto boxes, low boxes. So it could be even when you're out on a run, your master's athlete stops 3 or 4 times during the run, and you've got the curb, so you've got the road surface and you've got the curb to the sidewalk or pavement, and they just do a 2-footed jump up onto the sidewalk. So they're only jumping up, say 6 to 8 inches, but they do that 5 times and then run on and then do that. And so it's kind of integrating some sort of reactive work into your running. So the final thing I'm going to finish with is just to say briefly barefoot running. We've got to be very careful with that because, again, Jay Deshary has done a lot of work on the function of the first metatarsophalangeal joint, and I've done a lot of conversations with him about this and the role of the windlass mechanism within the function of the foot, which we haven't got onto. And basically, in the US, he believes that as many as 50% of high school boys and girls have an improperly functioning, they lack functional flexibility in their big toe joint. And for your master athletes, he thinks that could be as high as 80% have a non-functioning, non-flexible big toe joint. And somebody may say, well, my big toe is flexible, look. But you have to put the ankle in 30-degree dorsiflexion and then test the flexibility of the big toe. Because a lot of people, if the ankle is relaxed, can move the big toe. But the point is that when we're running, we need to have flexibility of the big toe whilst the ankle is reaching toe off. And so it's going to be effectively dorsiflexed. So some thoughts there. And so barefoot running, be very, very careful. Check your athletes. If they're one of those people who have very good functioning first metatarsophalangeal joints, big toe joints, then they can run barefooted without any worries other than that the groundskeeper has put weed killer and herbicide on fertilizer on the infield. Which we had some athletes in Oxford when I was coaching there. The soccer groundskeeper, the soccer infield was overly fertilized and overly herbicide, and several of the athletes actually burnt the soles of their feet running on that surface. So you've got to be really careful if you're running in bare feet what you're running on. Same with golf courses. Golf courses are notorious for putting too many chemicals on their grass. Okay, well, Richie, Jimson, Malcolm, thank you for the invitation, and good to see you guys. Any final thoughts? I hope this has given you stimulated some thoughts in your own coaching, and possibly encourage you to kind of go out and see whether this new material has any relevance to your own coaching.
Definitely.
Yeah, definitely. Great information, good food for thought, and makes us think more before we assign workouts. So no, thank you, Peter, for making the time today. I think it was informative. We have the recording for those who missed it. And Malcolm, I don't know when the next session, I think it's close to
29th.
Christmas. So yeah,
29th.
so just have,
Yeah.
yeah. So exactly 2 weeks from now. We don't have the agenda yet, but we'll find something or someone to speak.
And when you've had time to recover, Peter, we'll have you back again.
Yeah, and you're always welcome to join in as a listener or group.
Yeah,
Same time, same channel.
Yeah.
He gets the emails.
Yeah, no, I get the emails. I'm afraid that I suffer from seasonal affective disorder, and suffered even more with that, Alan, up in in Oregon this week. It's been decidedly dreek.
Well, it was a 7:30 in the morning start for you, Peter, so much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So you think you're sad that it's streak here? Last week I was in Las Vegas, being very happy.
Ah,
This week I'm back to work in the cold and dark. So I get where you're coming from.
right. Good to see you all. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Yeah, thank
Great,
you.
thanks,
Great.
Thanks, everybody.
I'll let Richie have that presentation.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Hey guys, seeing as you're still on, and I think I mentioned this before, Malcolm, it's due to my shift working. I get every second Wednesday off.
Right.
And when we started this on a Wednesday only, it was on my week off. It's now seemed to have evolved into my week on. I should actually be working today. It's my last day of annual leave. I start back work tomorrow.
Yeah.
In 2 weeks' time, I'll miss it.
Yeah, the thing that made that happen, Alan, was we did not do the Wednesday before the US Thanksgiving. So it pushed everything on a week. What we don't know at the moment is, and I don't think Richie does, he doesn't know what his schedule is going to be. I mean, we've mostly been on a Wednesday, I think, during the 20 months or so we've done this. But after the one on the 29th will be the same time. But after that, I'm not sure we know where we are at the moment. But I mean, obviously, we're always keeping in mind what is the most accessible day and time for everybody.
Yeah.
Well, it always works out the same for me. Like this week, I'm working, was it Wednesday, Thursday? So
Right.
next week, I have them off. And the following week, I'm working Wednesday, Thursday, and so on and so forth. Just where my shifts work. So if we could either move on a week or back a week, it'd be great for me.
Yeah, and there's always a chance. But I mean, how often will your shift change? I don't know.
It's like that forever and ever and ever. I could work out my shifts for the next 110 years. Because that's the way my shifts work.
Okay. All right. Well, absolutely, we'll keep it in mind.
Okay, definitely.
I hope you get to retire before 110 years are up, Alan.
Yeah.
I have 45 waist lifts to go, mate. 45 waist lifts.
I hate to say this, I hope I've retired before he does that. But
Okay.
all right, guys. Thank
Good
you.
guys, thanks everybody.
Cheers out.
Appreciate
Merry
it.
Christmas, folks. Don't see you.
Merry
Yeah.
Christmas.
Same to you,
Likewise.
Alan.
Cheers, pals.
Cheers. Bye.
Cheers.